My name is Ravi Anand, and for as long as I can remember, I have sought the face of God. Born into a family of scholars and seekers, my life was shaped by devotion, early morning chants, temple rituals, fasting, and meditation that stretched into the silence of the night. I was raised with the understanding that all truth flows from the eternal Brahman, the unseen force that governs all things, and that through discipline, enlightenment could be attained. But even in my deepest moments of meditation, even when I felt the presence of the divine, something always felt just beyond my grasp, like a word at the tip of my tongue that I could not speak. I was a teacher, a guru to many, yet I harbored questions I dared not voice aloud. Why did peace feel so fleeting, as though it was a reflection in a rippling pond, visible, yet never truly grasped? Why did my heart ache for something more, though I could not name it? There was an unspoken longing in my soul, a quiet ache that no one else seemed to share. My father, a humble man of faith, had once whispered to me as a child, "God is not just an idea, Ravi. He is not just silence. He is love, and love must be known." I had carried his words with me, unsure of what they meant. My father had been rejected by scholars who called his faith too simple, his devotion too emotional. He had never sought enlightenment through mere intellect. He believed God was near, that he could be found in more than just philosophy. I dismissed his ways then, thinking them naive, yet now I wondered if he had glimpsed something I had not. I had spent years teaching others how to let go, how to detach, how to silence their desires in order to transcend suffering. But deep down, I was still searching. And it was in that quiet longing that my life took an unexpected turn. It was a warm evening in the Himalayas, where I had retreated to seek greater spiritual clarity. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the temple bells ringing softly in the distance. I had been fasting, meditating for hours, my body weakened but my spirit reaching for something unseen. As I entered deeper into prayer, chanting the sacred mantras, a sudden stillness overtook me. The world around me seemed to pause. Then a sharp pain seized my chest. At first, I thought it was exhaustion, the weight of fasting and intense focus. But within moments, the pain became unbearable, as if an unseen hand had pressed against my heart. My breath grew short, my limbs weak, my vision blurred. I fell forward, the earth rising to meet me, and in that instant I knew this was death. But it was not fear that gripped me. It was the realization that I was leaving behind all that I had ever known. The world I had devoted my life to, the teachings, the meditations, the knowledge, all of it was fading into darkness. Yet the darkness did not last. In an instant I felt myself rising, weightless, as though I had shed the very concept of gravity. My body was no longer my own. I was no longer confined to flesh and bone. Light surrounded me, golden and warm, unlike anything I had ever encountered. It was not the cold, distant light of enlightenment I had sought. It was alive. It pulsed with love, with understanding, with a depth that filled every part of me. I was being drawn upward, not into the cycle of rebirth, but into something entirely different. The sensation was overwhelming, as if I had been blind my entire life, and was only now seeing for the first time. The colors were unlike any I had ever known, the air itself humming with a song I could not comprehend, but somehow understood in my soul. I was not alone. Figures stood before me, radiant and familiar. Some I recognized, great sages and saints from my own tradition, their faces peaceful, their eyes filled with knowing. But others were unknown to me, and yet they felt no less like family. Their presence spoke of a unity beyond time and division, a connection deeper than lineage or belief. And then the light intensified. A presence moved toward me, so brilliant, so overwhelming in its love, that I fell to my knees without even realizing it. It was not fear that made me bow. It was the sheer magnitude of holiness, of a love so complete that it stripped me of all pretense, all pride, all illusion of self-sufficiency. And then I saw him. At first, I did not understand. The figure before me radiated a love so deep, so personal, that I felt as though I had always known him, though I could not place his name. His eyes held eternity, yet they looked upon me as though I were the only soul that had ever existed. He did not speak, yet I heard him. "Ravi, you have searched for me." The words thundered through my being, yet they were gentle, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was not condemnation I felt, but recognition. I struggled to understand. "Who are you?" He smiled, and in that moment, understanding flooded through me. I had known him all my life, and yet I had never truly seen him. He was not a distant God, not an impersonal force, not an abstract concept to be contemplated. He was love incarnate. He was truth itself, standing before me. "Jesus," I whispered, the name foreign on my tongue, yet familiar in my soul. The radiance around him only grew, but it was not blinding. It was warm, drawing me in, filling every empty space within me. "You have always been mine," he said, and my heart broke. Not from pain, but from the sheer weight of love I had never understood. I wanted to stay there forever, to bask in the light, to remain in the presence of the one my soul had unknowingly longed for. But even as I reached toward him, a voice, gentle yet firm, called me back. "It is not time. You must return." Panic gripped me. How could I leave? How could I return to a life that suddenly felt so small, so incomplete? "You are not forsaken," he reassured me. "I will be with you." The words rang with undeniable truth. But before I could speak, before I could even begin to comprehend what was happening, I felt myself being pulled away. The light dimmed. The warmth faded. The world around me blurred, as though I were falling back through time, through space, through existence itself. And then, with a gasp, I opened my eyes. The room was filled with frantic voices, hands pressing against my chest, my body trembling as life returned to it. My lungs burned, my heart pounded, but none of it mattered, because I had seen him, and nothing could ever be the same again. I lay there, gasping for air, as reality clawed its way back into my senses. The flickering light of oil lamps, the murmured prayers of the disciples gathered around me, the sensation of the cold marble floor beneath my back, none of it felt real. Compared to where I had just been, this world felt dim, as if I had stepped into a shadow of what was true. "He's breathing." One of the devotees cried, pressing his hands together in prayerful gratitude. Another wept openly. They had thought me dead. Perhaps I had been. I blinked, struggling to focus as faces swam before me. The retreat leader, a wise and gentle man who had mentored me for years, knelt beside me, his eyes filled with both relief and questions he could not yet voice. "Ravijai," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of reverence and concern. "You were gone. No breath, no pulse." For nearly an hour, I closed my eyes, trying to process the impossible, the place I had been, the overwhelming love, the light, the presence of Jesus, had felt beyond time itself. And yet here I was, lying on the same temple floor where my body had collapsed. Slowly, I pushed myself upright, though my limbs trembled under the weight of the moment. Someone handed me a cup of water and I drank greedily, though my thirst was not of the body but of the soul. The retreat leader's voice was cautious but insistent. "What did you see?" I opened my mouth, but the words refused to come. How could I explain what had happened? How could I, a guru of Hindu tradition, tell them that I had stood in the presence of Jesus Christ? That I had not been sent into the cycle of rebirth, but into a place beyond anything our scriptures had described. That the path I had spent my life following was not complete, not false, but unfinished. I looked into their expectant faces, men and women who had followed my teachings, who had entrusted their spiritual journey to my guidance. How could I speak without shattering the foundation they had built their lives upon? I gripped my hands together to steady myself. I saw the divine. Murmurs of reverence filled the room. Some bowed their heads. Others leaned in eagerly, awaiting wisdom, expecting confirmation of what they had always believed. But I could not lie. I swallowed hard. It was not what I expected. The murmurs stilled. The air in the room grew thick with uncertainty. I closed my eyes and the memory of his presence rushed through me again. Jesus, radiant, his voice like the sound of 1,000 waters yet as intimate as a whisper. I saw him, I said, my voice shaking. Jesus, gasps rippled through the room. A few disciples stiffened while others exchanged wary glances. I knew what they were thinking. Had I truly returned from death, or had my mind fractured under the strain of my experience? One of my closest students, Arjun, stepped forward. "Gurujai," he said carefully, his brows furrowed in concern. "Perhaps the vision you saw was merely an aspect of the Brahman, one form among many. After all paths lead to the one, do they not?" It was the response I had expected. It was the response I would have given once. I shook my head. "No," I said softly but with certainty. "He was not an aspect. He was the fullness of truth itself." Silence. I pressed my fingers against my temples, struggling to find words that would make them understand what I barely understood myself. He was not just a great teacher, not just another enlightened one among many. He is the completion of all longing, the fulfillment of every soul's search. I looked around at the faces of my students. Some were open, curious, while others were tightening with unease, their devotion to our traditions warring with the strange testimony I now bore. A younger disciple, Asha, spoke hesitantly. "But Gurujai, if what you say is true, what does it mean for everything we have learned, everything you have taught us?" Her words pierced me because I had asked myself the same question. I had spent my life devoted to the study of scriptures, to the pursuit of enlightenment. What did it mean that I had been wrong? And yet I did not feel shame. I felt peace, because I had not been abandoned to ignorance but drawn into a deeper truth. "It does not mean our path was for nothing," I said, choosing my words carefully. "It means that the one we have sought, the truth we have longed for, was waiting for us all along in a way we did not recognize." More silence. Then the retreat leader sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead as if burdened by a great weight. "Ravi, listen to me," he said, dropping the formal honorific. He was no longer speaking to me as a disciple but as a friend. "You are exhausted. You have endured something beyond human understanding. Perhaps you should rest before you speak further." It was a kind way of telling me to stop, to reconsider, to retract. I could see it in his eyes. He did not want to lose me, and I did not want to lose them. These were my students, my brothers and sisters in faith. I loved them as my own family, but I had seen what I had seen. I had stood before him. I had heard his voice. And I could not deny it. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "I will rest," I said, nodding. "But my words will not change." The weight of my statement settled over them. No one spoke. Then, one by one, the disciples bowed and left the room. Some cast glances of reverence, others of confusion, a few of quiet sadness as though mourning the man they had known before. Only Arjun lingered, his expression unreadable. "You believe this, don't you?" I met his gaze. "I do." His jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Instead, he turned and walked away. I closed my eyes, exhaustion pressing down on me. My journey was no longer just my own. I had been sent back for a purpose. But would anyone be willing to listen? In the days that followed, whispers of my testimony spread. Some came to me in secret, curiosity burning in their eyes. Others avoided me altogether, the weight of my words too much to bear. The retreat leader, ever the man of patience, advised me to keep my revelations private. "You have been given something powerful," he told me one evening as we sat beneath the banyan tree where I had once led teachings on enlightenment. "But not everyone is ready for what you have seen. Faith is like a river, Ravi. It must flow naturally. You cannot force it. I understood his caution, but how could I be silent? The truth burned inside me, alive and relentless. I had spent my life seeking the ultimate reality, only to discover that he had sought me first. And yet, how could I explain that to those who had never felt his presence? Still, I tried. Late one evening, Asha came to me in the meditation hall, her steps hesitant. She was one of my most devoted students, her mind sharp, her heart sincere. Guruji, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to understand. I set aside the sacred texts I had been reading, texts that now felt both familiar and incomplete. Tell me, Asha, I said, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated, then knelt before me, her hands clasped in her lap. You always taught us that God is beyond form, she said carefully. That he cannot be contained in one being, one image. But now you say that he has revealed himself through Jesus. How can this be? It was a question I had once asked myself, and yet now the answer felt so clear. God is infinite, I said. That has not changed. But Asha, love is not a concept. It is not distant, and what I saw, what I felt, was not the love of an abstract force. It was personal, it was real. She frowned slightly, searching my face for any sign of uncertainty. But why would he take form? She asked. Why would he lower himself? I smiled, remembering the overwhelming presence of Christ, the sheer power of his humility. Because love does not remain distant, I said. Love reaches out. Love becomes known. What good is a God who remains untouchable when his children are suffering? Asha's lips parted slightly, as if she had never considered such a thing. Jesus did not come to erase what we have learned, I continued. He came to fulfill it. The longing we have always felt, the prayers we have chanted, the sacrifices we have made, they were all leading us to something greater, to him. She swallowed hard, looking away. And you truly believe this? I leaned forward. I have never believed anything more. She nodded slowly, but I saw the battle in her eyes, the fear of what this truth would cost her. I understood. That night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my chamber, I knew I could not remain here. This place, these people, had been my home, but the truth I carried was too great to be contained within the walls of a temple. I had to go. I did not know where or to whom, but I knew this. I had been sent back for a reason, and the one who had called me would show me the way. At dawn, I gathered my belongings, the weight of my choice settling deep in my chest. Before I left, I stood once more in the meditation hall, running my fingers along the old wooden floor. I had spent years searching for God in this place, but he had found me elsewhere. As I stepped onto the road that led away from the retreat, I did not look back. I walked forward toward an unknown path, guided by a voice I could not see, but now fully trusted. The journey was just beginning. The road stretched before me, winding through dense forests and open plains, leading toward a destination I did not yet know. I walked in silence, the weight of revelation pressing upon me, yet there was no fear. There was only certainty. Each step felt ordained, as if unseen hands were guiding me. I had spent my life searching for the divine in sacred texts, in disciplined meditation, in the pursuit of detachment. And yet, in the place beyond death, I had encountered him not as a distant force, but as a presence so full of love that it had undone everything I thought I knew. I did not know how I would be received. I had spent years as a respected guru, my words shaping the faith of many. Now I carried a truth that few would accept, but I could not turn back. After several days of walking, I reached the outskirts of my childhood village. The sight of it stirred something deep within me, a longing, a memory. My father's voice, soft yet insistent, whispering to me as a child, "God is near, Ravi, you will see." Had he always known? Had he glimpsed the truth that had taken me a lifetime to understand? I entered the village just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the simple homes and temple spires. The scent of jasmine and burning oil lamps filled the air, a fragrance from my youth. Then I heard the murmurs. Ravi has returned. I turned toward the voices and found a small group gathering near the temple steps. Some faces were familiar, men and women who had once sought my guidance, who had bowed before me in reverence. But now, there was hesitation in their eyes, as if they sensed I was not the same man who had left. An elder stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You were in the mountains," he said slowly. "They said you died." I met his gaze. "I did." The murmurs grew louder. Some stepped back. Others leaned in, waiting for me to explain. I took a breath. "I have returned with something to tell you." The elder studied me, then gestured toward the temple courtyard. "Come," he said. "Let us hear what you have to say." I followed him through the gates where more villagers had begun to gather. The air was thick with anticipation, with uncertainty. I knew my words would shake them. But I had not been given this truth to keep it hidden. I stood before them, my heart steady. "What I am about to say will be difficult to hear," I began. "But I ask only that you listen, not as followers of tradition, but as seekers of truth." The crowd stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I looked at each face, remembering the faith we had shared, the prayers we had spoken together. Then I spoke the words that would change everything. "I have seen the one we have been searching for," I said. "I have stood before him, and his name is Jesus." Gasps broke through the silence. Some recoiled. Others whispered to one another in disbelief. A younger man, his voice sharp with suspicion, stepped forward. "You were always a wise teacher, Ravi, but now you speak of the God of the Christians." "Why?" I held his gaze. "Because I have seen him." The elder, his face clouded with concern, spoke next. "And you are certain it was not a vision, a test from the gods?" I shook my head. "It was not a vision. It was real. More real than this moment, more real than the ground beneath our feet. I stood in his presence and I was known. Not as a seeker, not as a teacher, but as his." More murmurs. A few faces turned away, unwilling to hear more. But some, just a few, remained, their expressions shifting from disbelief to something else: curiosity, hope. Asha was among them. She had followed me, though she had not spoken a word. Now she stepped forward. "What did he tell you?" she asked. The memory of his voice, strong yet gentle, echoed within me. "That he is the fulfillment of all that we have sought," I said. "That he is not one path among many, but the path itself. That the love we long for, the peace we seek, is found in him alone." Asha's hands trembled. "Then, what of everything we have learned, everything we have practiced?" I did not hesitate. "It was not for nothing," I said. "It was preparation, a longing placed within us to lead us to him. And now the longing has been answered." The weight of my words settled over them. Some looked away, unwilling to accept what they had heard. Others stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Then the elder exhaled, his face weary. "These are dangerous words, Ravi," I nodded. "I know." He studied me for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. One by one, others followed, leaving me standing in the courtyard, the scent of incense lingering in the air. Only a handful remained. Asha. A few others. Their eyes held uncertainty, but they did not turn away. I had lost many that night. But I had also found something far greater, a beginning. The night air was thick with silence. The village had turned away, the temple doors had closed, and I stood beneath the vast, endless sky, feeling the weight of what had just happened. I had spoken the truth, and the truth had divided. Asha and the few who remained lingered in the courtyard, their faces unreadable. The oil lamps flickered between us, casting shadows against the temple walls. "What happens now?" she asked softly. I did not know how to answer. The path before me was uncertain. I had spent my life within these teachings, among these people. But now, I was an outsider in the very place that had once called me Guru. I looked toward the road that led beyond the village, toward the unknown. "I go where he leads," Asha frowned. "And where is that?" I hesitated. The answer had not yet been given to me. But one thing was clear: this message could not remain here, hidden among whispers and disbelief. It had to be carried beyond this place to those whose hearts were ready to hear. "I do not know," I admitted, "but I cannot stay." Ashah's eyes darkened with thought. She was not one to follow blindly. She had questioned, she had resisted, and yet she had not left. She took a slow breath. "Then I will go with you." I searched her face, looking for hesitation, for uncertainty. There was none. "You believe?" I asked. Ashah glanced toward the empty temple, the place where she had prayed since childhood. "I don't know if I understand," she said honestly, "but I cannot ignore what I have seen in you." The others who had stayed, 2 young men, a woman with an infant in her arms, nodded in agreement. Their faces were uncertain, but their hearts were open. That was enough. We left at dawn. The road stretched before us, winding through hills and valleys, leading us away from the life we had known. At first, the silence between us was heavy, burdened with unspoken fears and quiet grief. We had lost something, but we had gained something greater. As we walked, I found myself speaking, not as a guru, but as a man who had seen and could not keep silent. I told them of the place beyond death, of the overwhelming presence of Jesus, of the love that had filled me so completely that I could never return to what I was before. Ashah listened, her face unreadable. The others, too, absorbed my words, their eyes reflecting the war between their old beliefs and the stirring truth within them. Days passed. We stopped in small villages, speaking to those who would listen. Some scoffed, others walked away, unwilling to hear. But there were those, just a few, who stayed, who leaned in, who asked the same question I had once asked. Could this be true? One evening, as we rested beneath the shade of a mango tree, Ashah finally spoke. "You said Jesus told you he was the fulfillment of all things," she said, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "What does that mean for everything else?" It was the question that burned in every heart, the question that separated belief from doubt. I looked up at the sky, the stars spread across the heavens like a great tapestry. "It means that we were not abandoned in our searching," I said, "that even in our blindness, God was leading us to this moment." Ashah frowned. "But how can we leave behind what we have always known?" I smiled, for I had asked the same thing. "We are not leaving it behind," I said. "We are completing it." She was silent for a long time. Then she nodded as if something within her had settled. The journey continued. We walked for miles, speaking in hushed conversations at night, sharing the truth in the places where hearts were willing. And then, one day, we reached the city. It was a place of noise and movement, of merchants shouting and bells ringing, of temples rising into the sky. Here, faith was a currency, exchanged in rituals and offerings in the hopes of gaining favor with the unseen. I stood at the edge of the marketplace, watching the people move past, their eyes weary with longing. This was why I had returned, not for the approval of men, not for comfort or familiarity, but for them, for the ones who did not yet know that the love they were seeking had already found them. I turned to Ashah, to the others who had walked this far with me. "It begins here," I said, and with that we stepped forward into the unknown. The marketplace was alive with movement, a swirling river of merchants, seekers, and beggars, each carrying their own burdens, their own silent prayers. The scent of sandalwood and spices mixed with the smoke of temple fires, rising into the air like offerings to unseen gods. I stood at the edge, watching. Here faith was an unspoken currency, a transaction, an attempt to gain favor from deities who remained distant and unmoved. I had lived in this world, had taught in it, but now I saw it with different eyes. Ashah stepped beside me. "What now?" It was a simple question, yet its weight pressed against my chest. I did not have a plan. I only had a name that had shaken the very foundation of my being. A name that had filled the emptiness I had not even known I carried: Jesus. I looked at the faces of the people passing by, their eyes clouded with the weight of life. They were searching, just as I had been, and so I spoke. At first it was just a whisper, a few words offered into the shifting crowd. But as I spoke, something inside me stirred. A fire, small but steady. "I was once like you," I said, my voice carrying just beyond the noise. "A seeker. A man who spent his life searching for truth." A few heads turned, curious but wary. I took a step forward. I meditated in the silence of the mountains, studied the sacred texts, followed the path of renunciation. I did everything I was told would lead me to peace, and yet my soul remained restless. A few more turned. Some stopped, some walked away, but I continued. Then one day I died. This caught their attention. The crowd began to gather, drawn not by spectacle but by the weight of something deeper, something that spoke to their own fears, their own unanswered questions. I met their gazes. I left this world and I stood in the presence of the divine. A merchant scoffed. "Which God did you see?" I took a breath, knowing the moment had come. "Not a God among many," I said, "but the one who is above all, the one who completes all things." The crowd murmured. Some stepped back. Some leaned in. A priest in saffron robes frowned. "And who is this God?" I did not hesitate. "Jesus." A hush fell over them. The name carried weight, unfamiliar yet powerful. A man in the crowd, older, his face lined with years of searching, spoke. "Jesus is the God of the Christians. Why would he come to you?" I smiled because I had asked the same thing. "Because he is not the God of one people," I said. "He is the God of all." Some murmured in disbelief. Others exchanged glances. But I saw something in their eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, hope. Asha stepped forward. "You must hear him," she said, her voice clear. "I have walked with him. I have seen the change in him. He speaks the truth." The priest scoffed. "Then let him prove it. If this Jesus is the one above all, let him show us." I did not argue. I did not need to, because even as he spoke, a woman stepped forward. She was frail, her hands trembling, her body weighed down by sickness. The crowd parted for her as she approached, her eyes fixed on me. "Can he heal?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, at the pain in her eyes, the desperation, and then I remembered his voice. "I will be with you." I had no power of my own. I was no longer a guru, no longer a man of status, but I had been sent, and that was enough. I reached out, gently placing my hands over hers. "Jesus," I whispered, closing my eyes. "Let her see you." The air around us seemed to still, as if the marketplace itself was holding its breath. And then the woman gasped. Her trembling ceased. Strength returned to her limbs. She looked down at her hands as though they were no longer her own, then up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I am well," she whispered. The crowd erupted in murmurs, disbelief, awe. Some fell to their knees. Others turned away, unwilling to accept what they had seen. But I knew this was not my doing. He was here, and he was calling them just as he had called me. The priest who had mocked me took a slow step backward. His face was pale, his lips parted as if he wanted to speak but could not. And then the older man, the one who had first questioned me, knelt. "Tell us more," he said. Asha met my gaze, her eyes shining with something I had not seen before. "Faith." I turned back to the growing crowd, my heart steady. I had not come with clever words or grand miracles. I had only come with a name, and that name was enough. More people gathered as the word spread through the marketplace. Some came in awe, drawn by the sight of the woman who had been healed. Others came with skepticism, their arms crossed, their faces tight with doubt. The priest who had questioned me remained at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. I looked at them, at their searching eyes, their guarded hearts. These were my people, men and women who had spent their lives seeking, offering prayers to gods who remained silent, performing rituals that never fully lifted the weight from their souls. I understood them because I had once been one of them. I took a breath. "You have questions," I said, my voice steady. So did I. A man, middle-aged, his face hardened by years of toil, spoke up. "You claim this Jesus is the highest, that he is above even Brahman, above Krishna, above all others. But why would he come to you? You are not a Christian." I nodded. "That is the very reason he came," the crowd murmured. "I was not searching for Jesus," I continued. "I was not calling upon his name. I followed the path of the ancients. I studied the scriptures of our people. I sought God in the stillness, in the silence. And yet when I left this life, when I stood at the threshold of eternity, it was he who stood before me." More whispers, but no one interrupted. "He did not come to me as a stranger. When I saw him, I knew him. Not because I had studied his teachings, but because he had always known me." A woman in the crowd clutched her hands together. "But why him? Why not another?" I met her gaze. "Because he is the fulfillment of all we have longed for." The priest stepped forward then, his voice sharp. "You are saying he is the one we have waited for, that all our scriptures, all our prayers, everything has been leading to him." I held his gaze. "Yes." The weight of that word fell upon them like a stone dropped into a still pond. Some stiffened. Others took slow, hesitant breaths, as if the very air around them had changed. The priest shook his head. "Blasphemy," he muttered. But the older man, the one who had knelt, spoke again. "You speak as though he is not just a teacher, not just another enlightened one." I turned to him. "Because he is not." More silence, more waiting. I took another step forward. "For years I believed that the path to God was a journey of self-purification, that if we meditated long enough, sacrificed enough, suffered enough, we would reach him, that we had to climb to him." I exhaled. But I was wrong. I lifted my gaze, my voice quiet but unwavering, "because he came down to us." A gasp rippled through the crowd. I let the words sink in. "He did not demand that we find our own way. He did not remain distant, waiting for us to be worthy. He came, he took on flesh, walked among us, bore our burdens. He gave himself for us, for you." Asha let out a breath beside me, as if only now grasping the fullness of what I had been saying all along. I turned to the crowd. "You have spent your lives making offerings to gods who do not answer. But I tell you now, there is one who has already made the offering for you." The murmurs grew, some in awe, some in anger. The priest stepped forward again, his face flushed. "And you claim this Jesus is greater than all." I met his gaze, unshaken. "I do not claim it, he is." The tension in the air was thick. Some stood in defiance, unwilling to listen any longer. Others looked torn, their minds fighting against the truth their hearts already recognized. Then a voice from the back. A young boy, no more than 10, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What must we do?" The simple question silenced everything. I turned to him, kneeling so I was at his level. "Believe," I said. "Call upon his name. You do not have to climb to him. He has already come for you." Tears filled the boy's eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, he whispered, "Jesus." The wind stirred through the marketplace, as if even creation was listening, and then something shifted. The old man who had knelt before now lifted his hands. "I want to know him," he said. "This Jesus. If he is the one, I want to know him." Asha let out a quiet sob. One by one, others echoed his words. "I want to know him." Not all, not even most. Many still turned away, their hearts unwilling. But those who stayed, those who whispered his name for the first time, something changed in their faces. Hope, faith. I looked at them, my heart full. It had begun. And it would not stop here. The marketplace was no longer the same. The air felt charged, as if something unseen had been set in motion. Those who had whispered his name stood in quiet wonder, as if the words had carried more power than they had expected. Others still lingered on the edges, uncertain, watching. The priest's face was tight with anger. He took a step forward, pointing at me. "You are deceived," he said, his voice low but sharp. "And now you are deceiving others." I did not flinch. "You not see what you are doing?" he pressed. "You are abandoning your own people, your own heritage. You speak as if we have been blind all this time." The weight of his words hung between us. I had expected this. How could I not? But I did not come to destroy. I had not returned to strip my people of their identity. I had come because I had seen what they were searching for. I took a breath. I do not reject where I have come from, I said. I do not reject the longing, the devotion, the prayers. I do not reject the seeking. The priest's eyes narrowed. But I have found the answer, I continued. And the answer does not erase the journey. It fulfills it. The murmurs around us stirred again. Some nodded, hesitant but listening. Others shook their heads, unwilling to accept it. I turned to the priest, to the skeptics who watched. If a man spends his life searching for water and then, one day, finds a river, does he reject his search? No. He rejoices because his search has led him to the very thing he longed for. Asha inhaled sharply beside me. The older man who had knelt before now closed his eyes as if the truth was finally breaking through. I was a seeker, I said, my voice steady. I searched with all my heart, and he found me. The priest's jaw clenched. You speak of this Jesus as if he is the only way. I met his gaze without hesitation, because he is. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back. A few shook their heads and walked away, unwilling to hear more. But others remained. Asha reached for my arm, her fingers trembling. I turned to her. She swallowed hard. I believe you, she whispered. I don't understand everything yet, but I believe. Emotion tightened my throat. I nodded. The old man placed a hand over his chest. What must we do? I stepped forward, looking at him, looking at the others who had stayed. Speak his name, I said. Call upon him. He is near. The old man took a breath. Then, slowly, he knelt again. Jesus, he whispered. It was not a chant, not a ritual. It was a name spoken for the first time with understanding. And as he said it, a change came over his face. The weight in his eyes lifted. The burden of striving, of endless searching, eased. He exhaled, and for the first time he looked at peace. The others watched. Then, one by one, they followed. Jesus. Some whispered. Some spoke with trembling voices, but each one who said his name changed. Tears streamed down Asha's face. She did not kneel, but she did not walk away. The priest, seeing what was happening, shook his head in fury. You are leading them away from the gods of their fathers, I turned to him. No, I said softly. I am leading them home. His face burned with anger, but he said nothing more. Instead, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd, his robes whipping behind him. I exhaled. The choice had been made. Some had turned away, but others had stayed, and that was enough. The old man rose, wiping his eyes. Tell us more, he said. I smiled, and I did. For hours, we sat in the marketplace, and I spoke, not as a guru, not as a teacher of philosophy, but as a man who had seen the truth. I told them what I knew, what I had experienced, who he was. The city had once felt like an ocean of strangers, an endless river of people moving past without meaning. But now it was something else, a beginning. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the faces of those who had chosen to stay. I knew this was only the start. There would be opposition. There would be rejection. There would be those who would try to silence this truth. But the truth could not be silenced. I had seen him. And now others had seen him too. I did not know where this road would lead, but I knew one thing: I would not walk it alone. As night fell over the city, we remained in the marketplace, a small gathering of those who had chosen to listen. The oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows across the stone streets, and the distant hum of temple bells carried through the air. The old man sat beside me, his eyes reflecting a peace I had never seen in him before. Asha, though still wrestling with her thoughts, stayed close, listening intently. Others had come quietly, cautiously. Some lingered at a distance, watching, waiting. Word had spread. The name of Jesus, spoken in this place for the first time, had stirred something that could not be undone. I turned to the old man. Tell me your name. He smiled, his face lined with years of searching. Dev. I nodded. "Dev, what do you feel?" He placed a hand over his heart. "Lighter," he whispered. "Like the weight I have carried all my life has been lifted." I exhaled. "That is him." He closed his eyes briefly as if savoring the moment. "I have spent my years making offerings, chanting prayers, seeking peace, and yet it has always been just beyond my reach." He looked at me, tears brimming in his eyes. "Tonight I have found it." Asha sat forward. "But why?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "Why is his name different from the others? Why does it change something?" I looked at her, feeling the same question stir deep within me. "Because his name is not just a word," I said. "It is not an incantation or a symbol. It is him." She frowned. "I don't understand." I took a breath. When I was in his presence, I did not feel the striving, the endless need to prove myself worthy. I did not feel that I had to reach for him. My voice grew softer, because he had already reached for me. Asha inhaled sharply. "In every other path we must ascend," I continued. "We must purify ourselves, remove our desires, detach from suffering. We must make the journey to the divine." I turned to Dev, to the others who had stayed. "But Jesus," I swallowed. "Jesus made the journey to us." A hush fell over them. I looked at each face, searching their eyes. "Do you see?" I asked. "He did not stay distant, he came. He stepped down from eternity, walked among us, bore our suffering, carried the weight we could never carry ourselves. He became the bridge so that we do not have to build one." Dev let out a quiet sob, pressing his hands together in gratitude. Asha, however, looked away. "If this is true," she whispered, "then why has no one told us?" I sighed. "Because we were never meant to find it through force or tradition. He calls each of us in his own way, in his own time." She looked at me again, her eyes searching mine. "And you believe this is that time?" I nodded. "Yes." The others murmured in agreement. Even those who did not yet fully understand could feel it. This was not just another teaching. It was not just another path. It was an answer. Dev turned to me. "What do we do now?" I looked around at them, at these souls who had chosen to stay. I did not have a grand plan. I did not have a temple or a doctrine to give them, but I had his name. I exhaled. "We go forward." Asha stared at me, her brows furrowed. "To where?" I smiled. "Wherever he leads." She let out a breath, shaking her head with a small laugh. "That is not much of a plan, Ravi." I laughed softly. "No, it is not." I met her gaze. "But it is enough." She did not argue. Instead, she whispered, "Then I will go." Dev nodded. "So will I." One by one, the others echoed the same. I felt the weight of what was happening, the quiet but undeniable stirring in the air. Something had begun, something that could not be stopped. I stood, looking at the city before us, at the temples that had stood for generations, at the streets where seekers had walked just as I had. And then I spoke the only words that mattered. "Jesus, lead us." And with that, we stepped into the unknown. We left the marketplace before dawn, moving through the sleeping streets in quiet reverence. The city, once a place of restless searching, now felt different, as though a shift had taken place in the unseen. I could not explain it, but I knew something had begun, something irreversible. Dev walked beside me, his face lined with thought, his fingers running over the prayer beads he had carried for years. But he was no longer muttering the mantras of old. He simply held them, as though uncertain whether they still carried meaning. Asha was quiet. She had chosen to come, but I could see the turmoil in her eyes. Her entire life had been shaped by a different understanding of God, of enlightenment, of the nature of the soul. And yet, she could not deny what she had seen, what she had felt when his name was spoken. We did not yet know where we were going, but I did not feel lost. I had felt lost for most of my life, even when I did not recognize it. Now, despite the uncertainty, I felt more found than I ever had. The road stretched before us, winding through villages and open plains, past rivers that shimmered in the early morning light. We walked in silence for some time, the weight of our journey pressing down on us. Finally, Dev spoke. "Where will we go first?" I turned to him. To those who are searching, he nodded, as if that answer was enough. It was a Shah who asked the question that had been lingering in all of our minds. And what will we say? I exhaled. The truth. She frowned slightly. You think they will believe? I hesitated before answering. Not all, I admitted. Many will reject it, some will mock us, some will even call us enemies, she swallowed. And if they try to silence us, I met her gaze. Then we will speak anyway. She nodded, but the tension in her shoulders did not ease. As the sun climbed higher, we reached the first village, a quiet place where farmers moved through the fields, their backs bent under the weight of the harvest. Smoke curled from small clay houses and children ran barefoot through the dirt paths. No grand temples, no scholars, just people. People who had lived as we had lived, who had prayed as we had prayed, who had searched as we had searched. I knew then. This was where we were meant to begin. We stepped into the village and eyes turned toward us. Curious, wary, I did not hesitate. I stepped forward and spoke. My friends, I said, I have something to tell you. A few stopped their work, their faces unreadable. A child peeked from behind his mother's sari, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. A man in a worn tunic wiped the sweat from his brow and frowned. Who are you? I met his gaze. My name is Ravi Anand. I was once a teacher, a seeker, a man who spent his life searching for God. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded as if understanding the path I had walked. I took another step forward, and I have found him. More murmurs. A few skeptical glances. I did not stop. I left this world. I crossed into the place beyond life. And there I stood before the one who is above all. The man who had first spoken narrowed his eyes. Which God did you see? I took a breath. Not one among many, I said, but the one who fulfills all things. His name is Jesus. The murmurs became sharper, voices rising in confusion and disbelief. Some crossed their arms, their expressions growing tight, but one, a woman, elderly, her face carved with years of hardship, stepped forward. Jesus, she repeated. I have heard his name. I turned to her. Where? She hesitated. A man passed through here once, a foreigner. He spoke of him, but we did not understand. He said Jesus had come to take away sin, to bring salvation. I nodded. That is true. The man in the tunic shook his head. We do not need saving, he said firmly. We have our ways. Our prayers, our traditions. Why should we listen to you? I took a slow breath. Because I was as you are. I followed the same path. I prayed the same prayers. I believed as you do that if I lived well enough, if I purified myself enough, I would reach him. I let the words sink in. But when I stood before him, I saw the truth. It was not my striving that brought me to him. It was his love that brought him to me. The elderly woman listened, her eyes thoughtful. And what does he ask of us? I stepped closer. That you believe. A hush fell over them. Some shifted uneasily. Others looked away. I could see it, the battle in their hearts, the war between what they had always known and what they could not deny they had just felt. Then from the back of the crowd, a single voice. I want to know more. A young man, his face uncertain but open. I smiled. And so I told them. I spoke of the love I had felt, of the presence that had undone me. I told them how he had spoken my name, how he had sent me back, not just to live, but to tell them. Some listened. Some turned away, but those who stayed knew. The name of Jesus had been spoken in this place, and it would not be forgotten. As the night fell over the village, I sat beneath a tree, looking up at the sky. The stars stretched across the heavens, vast and endless. Asha sat beside me. You think they will believe? I looked at her. Some. She was quiet for a moment. And the others, I exhaled. They will remember. She nodded as if that answer was enough. The road before us was long. There would be rejection, opposition, perhaps worse. But I had seen him, and I would never be the same. As I closed my eyes, a single thought filled my heart. This was only the beginning.